In the town of Dry Creek, the sun didn't just shine, it punished. It was the kind of heat that baked secrets into the dust, and on a day like this, a secret was about to arrive on the noon stagecoach. Her name was Annie Oakley, a mail-order bride sent for by a man the town called a giant. A silent, walking ghost named Jesse James. She came looking for a new life. But she had no idea she was walking into a war, and that the only weapon she had was a loaf of bread. The stagecoach groaned to a halt, sighing a cloud of dust that tasted like failure. Annie stepped down, and the town of Dry Creek sized her up in a single cruel glance. At 25, she looked like a ghost already, her dress faded, her face thin with a hunger that went deeper than food. She clutched a battered trunk in one hand, and with the other, she held her own chest, as if trying to keep her heart from rattling right out of her body. The whispers started immediately, sharp and mean as horseflies. "Mail order," someone muttered from the livery. "Looks like she ain't eaten in a week." Another voice, a woman's, cut through the heat. "He'll never want her, not a giant like Jesse James." The name hung in the air, part legend, part threat. Annie had his letter tucked away, its words as sparse and hard as the land around her. "If you can cook and if you can work, then come." That was it. That was the entire promise she had traveled 1,000 miles for. Now, standing in the dust, with the town's judgment pressing in, that promise felt dangerously thin. Then she saw him. He was walking beside a wagon pulled by 2 slow-moving oxen, his frame so large it seemed to bend the heat waves around him. He had no hat, and his hair was a tangled mess. He didn't just walk on the earth, he seemed to command it with each heavy, deliberate step. It was Jesse James. The whole town turned, watching, waiting. They were waiting for a sign, a nod, anything to show he claimed this woman who had come for him. But Jesse didn't even look at her. He just kept walking, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if she were nothing more than a tumbleweed in his path. Annie's throat went dry. The stagecoach pulled away, leaving her utterly, terrifyingly alone. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. Instead, she planted her trunk in the dust like a flag, a declaration. She would not be erased. That night, she found a room at the boarding house, but the owner, Mrs. Whitlow, offered no kindness. "Work if you must, girl," she'd said, "but that man don't need no wife bought by postage." So Annie scrubbed floors until her hands were raw. She ate nothing. As the sun bled out across the sky, she saw him again. Jesse was loading sacks onto his wagon, his movements slow, heavy with a weariness she recognized. Their eyes met across the street, just for a second. A silent, charged moment. Then he turned away. With a trembling hand, Annie took the last of her travel bread, a small, hard loaf, and set it on the edge of his wagon. It was a foolish gesture, a desperate prayer. She scurried away into the shadows, her heart pounding. Later that night, from her window, she saw him. He sat by his wagon under a sky full of cold stars, breaking her bread in his hands. He ate it slowly, piece by piece, and Annie knew. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of the fight. The silence between them became a language. Annie scrubbed floors at the boarding house, her stomach aching with hunger, the town's whispers following her like shadows. "More ox than man," she heard them say about Jesse. "Don't speak. Don't laugh. Don't need no wife." Every few days he would come to town, a silent giant moving through a world that gave him a wide berth. He never looked at her, but she felt his presence like a change in the weather. Then came the day at the market. Annie stood trying to buy a handful of beans, her few coins feeling worthless in her palm. A young ranch hand laughed from the saloon porch. "Look there, boys! Shopping for a husband, not beans!" The laughter was like a slap. Humiliation burned in her cheeks. She fumbled her money, and a single coin dropped, rolling into the dust. Before she could move, a huge, scarred hand picked it up. Jesse James stood over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He didn't speak. He just placed the coin back in her hand, his calloused fingers brushing hers. His eyes, the color of river stones, held hers for a single, shocking second. Then he was gone. The ranch hands on the porch fell silent. The laughter died in their throats. That night, Annie baked. She used the last of her flour to make a small, coarse loaf of bread. She left it on his wagon again, a silent answer to his silent defense. The next night she saw him eating it, and so it began. Their strange, silent courtship. She would leave him small things, a jar of broth, a few biscuits. He would leave things for her, a sack of potatoes on the boarding house steps, her worn-out shoes, mended and polished, sitting by her door. No words, no notes, just these quiet acts of survival. But the town saw everything, and their cruelty grew sharper. "She's feeding him like a stray," Mrs. Whitlow sneered. "A desperate woman is a pathetic sight." Annie's defiance hardened. Every crumb she gave him was an act of war against their scorn. One afternoon, she took refuge in the empty church, the heat oppressive. She sank into a pew, her body weak, and whispered a prayer not for help, but just for the strength to keep standing. She didn't know Jesse had stepped inside to leave his own tithe of jerky and beans. He stood in the shadows at the back, listening. He heard her quiet, desperate plea. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched the woman who was fighting a battle with silence, just like him. He left as quietly as he'd come. But something had changed. He had heard her prayer. The town was a cage of whispers and stares, and Annie felt the walls closing in. The silent gifts were not enough. The unspoken language was not enough. She knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that something had to break. One night, as the moon silvered the dust, she sat on the porch, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. Across the street, Jesse stood in the shadows, holding the loaf of bread she had left for him. He hadn't eaten it yet. He was just standing there, watching her. And Annie knew, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that this silent war was about to turn bloody. She had to force his hand, or be destroyed by the town's hatred. Frost came, biting at the edges of the town, and Annie felt a new kind of cold sink into her bones. The silent offerings weren't enough. The town's scorn was a poison, and it was killing her slowly. One night, she didn't leave the bread on his wagon. She walked right past the edge of town, out onto the open prairie where a single lantern glowed in the distance. She walked straight to his cabin. When she knocked, the door opened, and he filled the frame, a silent, unmovable giant. The firelight behind him carved his face into shadows. "I thought you might want this warm," she said, her voice trembling as she held out the loaf of bread. He stepped aside. The cabin was bare, built for work and nothing else, but it was warm. He pointed to a chair by the fire, and she sat, her hands twisted in her lap. He cut the bread and gave her a piece. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. In the warmth of his cabin, the simple bread tasted like hope. Finally, she spoke. She told him about the fever that took her family, about the crushing silence of an empty house. "I thought," she whispered, "that maybe someone out here might need me." Jesse stared into the fire. His voice, when it came, was like stones grinding together. "Ranch don't need much more than work. Don't bring much joy." It was a confession, a crack in the wall of his silence. "Maybe you don't need joy," she said softly. "Maybe you just need someone to make the work lighter." His eyes met hers, and for a long moment, the world stopped. But the town wouldn't let them be. The next day, the whispers were a roar. Someone had seen her leave his cabin in the moonlight. "She spent the night," the story went, growing uglier with each telling. At the church supper that Sunday, the widow Ruth Dawson, her face pinched with bitterness, stood up. Cooking won't buy you a husband, child, she said, her voice loud and cruel. Feeding Jesse James don't make you fit to share his name. The room rippled with smug laughter. Annie felt the heat of 100 eyes on her. She was about to run when a new voice cut through the noise. Jesse. He stood at the end of the long table, his shadow falling over everyone. Her bread, he said, his voice a low thunder, kept me standing when nothing else could. The words dropped like stones into a silent pond. The laughter died. Every face in the room turned, stunned. Later that night, a real storm broke, rain lashing against the windows. Annie couldn't stand the confines of her room. She ran out into the downpour, her feet carrying her back to his cabin. He opened the door, rain dripping from his beard. She stumbled inside, soaked and shaking. The words poured out of her, a desperate, final plea. I'll cook for you every day, she sobbed. I'll make the work lighter. Just make me your wife. The raw, naked request hung in the air between them, more powerful than the thunder outside. Jesse's face was a mask of stone. The silence stretched, tight and unbearable. Annie thought her heart would break. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward her. He just took his heavy coat from its peg and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The warmth of it, the scent of him, was an answer of its own. But as she stood there, wrapped in his coat, Annie saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, not just sorrow, but a terrible, burning guilt. She realized with a sickening lurch that his silence wasn't about her at all. It was a prison, and he was terrified of letting anyone else in. The storm passed, but the air in Dry Creek was heavier than ever. Annie's desperate plea in the cabin had changed everything. Jesse's silence was no longer a wall. It was a battlefield. He was at war with himself. The town saw the shift. They saw the way he walked beside her now, a silent guard against their whispers. They saw the way his eyes followed her, filled with a tormented tenderness. The widow, Ruth Dawson, saw it too, and her hatred grew. He won't have her, she'd hiss at the mercantile. His family has a dark history. That land is cursed. She'll be gone by spring, you'll see. Annie pretended not to hear, but the words chilled her. She started to see the truth in them. Jesse was haunted. The silence he lived in wasn't peace. It was penance. One night, by the fire, he finally spoke of it. He told her about his younger brother, taken by a fever one brutal winter. I was supposed to ride for the doctor, Jesse said, his voice a raw whisper. But I waited. The storm was too bad, I told myself. I was a coward. He died in my arms. The confession hung in the small cabin, a ghost given voice. I vowed then, he said, I'd never be responsible for another's pain. I'd bear my burdens alone. Annie's heart broke for him. That wasn't your fault, she whispered, her hand finding his. His hand was a stone in hers. It doesn't matter. A vow is a vow. The town's final assault came at the harvest supper. Annie had baked her bread, her hands steady now. She had a place, even if it was unspoken. But Ruth Dawson wasn't finished. She stood, her face a mask of righteousness. We all know what this woman is after, she declared. His land. A place she hasn't earned. Jesse James deserves better than a woman who throws herself at him. The room was silent, waiting for the explosion. Before Annie could even breathe, Jesse was on his feet. He didn't look at Ruth. He looked at Annie. The silence broke. Not with a whisper, but with a roar. Enough, he thundered, the single word shaking the rafters. He strode down the length of the table and stopped in front of her. He went down on one knee. The entire town gasped. Annie Oakley, he said, his voice thick with emotion, loud enough for every soul to hear. You fed me when I was starving. You stood by me when the whole world turned its back. You are not a burden. You are a miracle. He took her hand. The work is lighter with you, he said. The silence is bearable. Will you be my wife?" Tears streamed down Annie's face, but her voice was strong. "Yes." The silence of the room was broken by a single grudging clap, then another, and another. It wasn't a celebration, it was a surrender. The town had lost. Their wedding was quiet. They stood in the small church, the pews mostly empty, and spoke their vows. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had survived. That night, in the cabin, the fire burned bright. Jessie broke a loaf of Annie's bread and handed her the first piece. The silence between them was no longer a cage. It was a home. Outside, the prairie stretched out under a sky full of stars. They had carved a life out of dust and scorn, out of silence and bread. They had faced down the town's judgment and the ghosts of the past, and in the quiet of their small cabin, they had found something that neither of them had ever expected: peace. If you believe that kindness can break through even the hardest silence, and that a little bit of courage can change everything, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we have in store.